Today, we're really getting into the Productivity Commission's big review from January 2024. It's all about the national agreement on closing the gap.
That's right. A really crucial look at why things aren't moving as fast as hoped.
Exactly. We want to unpack why efforts to get equal life outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people seem to be, well, falling short, and figure out what this paradigm shift everyone talks about actually needs to look like.
Yeah, what does it really mean in practice?
Okay, so let's start with the agreement itself, signed in 2020.
Yeah, by all Australian governments, federal, state, territory, and importantly, the coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organizations. The unique setup.
It really was Australia's big commitment, wasn't it, to tackle that deep-seated inequality. Sounds incredibly ambitious.
Well, absolutely. And the key thing, I think, was it wasn't just about those socioeconomic targets, health, education. It brought in these 4 priority reforms. They were meant to be a totally new way of working.
A new way of working designed to fundamentally change how governments engage.
Precisely. To move beyond the old top-down approaches.
Okay, powerful stuff on paper. But the Commission's review, what did it actually find? Are governments, doing this new way of working?
Well, the headline finding is pretty stark. It says governments are, and I quote, not adequately delivering.
Not adequately delivering. Oof.
Yeah. Progress is described as weak, uncoordinated, and piecemeal.
So basically, despite the agreement, it's still business as usual.
That's exactly what the review suggests. It points to a real failure, it seems, to grasp just how much change is needed, like a fundamental rethink is required.
Wow. Okay, so that's a big finding right there. And the review tries to explain why, right? It talks about this core issue, that the gap is, quote, not a natural phenomenon. What do they mean by that?
All right, this is critical. The review argues the gap is a direct result of how governments have used power historically. And because of that history...
There's a lack of trust.
A serious lack of trust, yeah. Because decisions aren't genuinely shared. Priority Reform 1 is all about shared decision-making, but the finding is that governments often still,
keep hold of the reins?
Exactly. They retain power, maybe consult a bit, but often on solutions they've already cooked up, still assuming they know best.
So that Priority Reform 1 isn't quite landing in practice. Was there any sign they can share power effectively?
Well, interestingly, yes. The report points to the COVID-19 pandemic. Remember that?
Vaguely, yes. Bit of blur.
Yeah. Well, during that crisis, governments had to partner properly with Aboriginal community-controlled health organizations. And it worked. They genuinely shared decision-making because they were forced to by the situation. But, as the review notes, once that immediate crisis pressure eased off, they tended to slip back into the old ways.
Business as usual crept back in. That's disappointing, isn't it? It shows it's possible, but the will isn't always there unless it's an emergency.
It does raise questions, though you do see positive counterexamples, like Victoria's treaty process, which actually legislates for power sharing by agreement. That's structurally different.
Right, building it into the system. Okay, so shared decision-making is patchy. What about supporting Indigenous communities to lead? That brings us to Priority Reform 2, building the community-controlled sector.
Yeah, the ACCOs. The review is clear. These organizations get better results. They know their communities.
Makes sense.
But they're often treated like passive recipients of funding. They get told how to run programs, forced to fit generic models, the whole square pegs into round hole thing. It limits how effective they can be.
So even the successful models aren't fully empowered. Okay, what about changing government itself? Priority Reform 3, transforming government organizations.
That one, the review says, has barely begun.
Barely begun, wow.
Yeah. The focus seems to be on, small things. Individual actions like cultural awareness training, which is useful, but...
But it's not the deep systemic change needed.
Exactly. It's not really tackling institutional racism or embedding cultural safety right through the system structures. It's more surface level so far.
Okay. And the last one, Priority Reform 4, shared access to data.
Also, very little progress reported there. A key issue is that data often keeps reinforcing those deficit narratives, focusing only on problems.
Right, not on strengths or community priorities.
Precisely. And that's why there's such a strong call for Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance.
So communities control their own stories, their own data.
Yes. It's about owning and controlling their information, how it's used, the narratives it creates. That's seen as critical.
Okay, this paints a picture of, well, a lot of ambition, but a real disconnect in action, which leads us to accountability, right? The review really hammers this home. Are governments being held accountable?
This is flagged as a major issue, a severe accountability gap.
Meaning?
Meaning the current mechanisms just lack bite. There are effectively no consequences for failure.
No consequences, even when governments do things that seem to contradict the agreement.
Apparently so. The review mentions Queensland's youth justice laws, for instance, as something that seemed to fly in the face of the closing the gap commitments, but no real mechanism to enforce accountability.
So, if there are no real consequences, how do you drive change? What's the Commission's answer?
Their key recommendation is for a stronger, genuinely independent mechanism.
Independent.
Yes. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led, importantly, with a proper legislative basis, guaranteed funding, and real teeth actual powers to monitor and report on how governments are transforming or not transforming.
So putting the power to hold governments accountable partly in the hands of Indigenous leaders themselves.
That seems to be the core idea, empowering those most affected to drive that accountability.
So the big takeaway for governments seems to be, this isn't about tweaking things, it's fundamental.
Absolutely. Rethinking systems, embedding cultural capability, not just as training, but in job roles, in structures, and, of course, properly resourcing the agreement so it can actually be implemented, not just lip service.
It really underlines that closing the gap demands that deep foundational change, doesn't it? Not just tinkering around the edges. And maybe for you, listening, it prompts a thought. How deep do these kinds of power dynamics run in any large organization, not just government? What does it genuinely take for that paradigm shift, that real systemic overhaul to happen? It goes way beyond just policy documents, doesn't it?
It's about fundamentally changing how power works, how it's shared, and rebuilding trust from the ground up, a huge task.